Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'll be your host today. My name is Maxwell Gobbell, and we'll be interviewing for the Los Angeles Beverly Arts as well as the Beverly Arts channel. Today I have two artists joining me. The sculptor, very renowned and talented Joe Davidson. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
How you doing today?
I'm okay. How about yourself?
Pretty great, pretty great. Happy to have you here.
Okay.
We're also being joined currently by Mr. Jiannan Huang, who is with us via an overseas call. He couldn't make it here today, but here he is. Jiannan, ni hao.
谢谢。
Shishi.
Thank you.
Shishi. We're very happy to have you both here with us. So today I thought we could get into the conversation between the interaction between sculptors and oil painters. Jiannan, I know you're a painter yourself, and Joe, you're a sculptor. So, I mean, Joe, just in general, how do you see the two artists, sculptors and painters, being able to come together and learn from each other's artistic works?
Well, I think it's. I think there's a long history, especially in like Western culture, of sculptors and painters, not so much like always just like working together and influencing each other, but also like sculptors paint and then painters start dabbling in sculpture. So I think there's always like this overlap that has been happening. Excuse me, just for centuries, if not millennia, of I'm thinking just off the top of my head, like Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor, but his probably most well-known work is a painter, as a painter, and it happens, and like I just on my day-to-day, I'm constantly looking at works of painters, and they have some influence on me, whether it's direct or indirect, whether it's like a certain color, whether it's like a composition or something like that. It happens all the time. It's about like following ideas.
Absolutely. Do you do any painting yourself?
I did painting when I was a wee lad. So when I was in college, as just part of like the kind of program of going through art school, I did a lot of painting and a lot of drawing, and I didn't really feel like I took off until I started doing sculpture. So it felt like it was almost like training for me for sculpture, and then once I found sculpture, I felt like my brain like turned on, and that's when I really got excited about the whole process of making again.
It all clicked for you.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so cool. I love hearing about artists' journey of like how they discovered themselves as an artist. Their identity as an artist.
Right.
Yeah, that's really incredible. Jiannan, do you have any comments on the question? We'll have our translator here for us.
我觉得呢，雕塑家可以在，可能就更注重作品的立体感，而油画家呢，他注重那个平面的结构和色彩的运用，还有那个光影，他把它做成更有立体感，像雕塑一样，看上去立体感更强。所以呢，雕塑家可以从油画中学习平面的色彩和运用的技巧。那个油画家呢，可以借鉴雕塑中的空间和立体的表现方法。另外呢，雕塑家和油画家都需要具备很好的审美能力和创新能力。在艺术创作中，创新和独特性的会是非常重要的。没有创新就没有艺术。要说借鉴，我个人认为借鉴其他艺术家的创新手法。创新思想是最关键的。
Without innovation, there is no art. In terms of reference, I personally think that the most important thing is to learn from other artists' innovative methods and innovative ideas.
Very inspiring. Thank you. Thank you, Jiannan. So, diving into the specifics here, what the specific aspects of, the arts of painting and sculpting, things like, creative themes, use of color and space, the combination of these things. What aspects do you see, painting and sculpting really being able to complement each other and learn from each other in, Joe?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, just because of the fact that painting, in its sort of essence, because it starts on the depiction of like a fictitious space in some way, right? The kind of traditional idea of the painting as a window, and then you are sort of like looking through a window into another world or into another thing, and that contrasts with sculpture as something that is sort of rudimentarily in this world. It's something that literally like takes up space, and it's something that you have to look at from multiple perspectives and multiple angles, and it's something that incorporates time, which is one of the really kind of like fundamental differences between painting and sculpture. Like, in order to experience a sculpture, you walk around it, you spend time at it, you look at it from different angles. Whereas a painting, you can really sort of experience it primarily through one vantage point. Like, those sort of contrasts, I think, are something that I think are really interesting for me as a sculptor to think about when I'm looking at how am I sort of presenting a work at like a certain angle, or how, like, when somebody like walks into a room and sees one of my pieces, like, what's the kind of like proper perspective on it, or what's the sort of just the like correct viewing point or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like I get that influence from painters, and I get that influence from the sort of looking through the window aspect of painting, as opposed to, doing it with three-dimensionality.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up those two different perspectives. It's almost like, they're inverted, whereas, like you were talking about, is one you're looking through the window, and then one you're in the window and you're walking around it, looking. That's really interesting. Jiannan, what are your thoughts?
创作主题上，雕塑和油画都可以选择相同，或相似的主题进行创作，例如人像啊、自然风景等。创作者呢，可以用不同的艺术形式来表现同一个主题。色彩应用方面，油画大量使用颜料来表现色彩，
In terms of color application,
雕塑中呢，可以
oil painting
使用
uses a
颜料
large number of
进行着
pigments
色。
to express
雕塑
colors,
家也可以借
while
鉴油
sculptors
画
can also
用
use
色彩来
pigments for the
渲
coloring.
染灵感、烘托气
Sculptor
氛的
can learn from
方法。
oil painting how to
油画
use
家呢，
color
可以从雕塑中
to
学
express
习到如何
emotions
用
and enhance
材料、颜料
atmosphere,
来
while
表现
oil
光
painters
影、阴暗
can
面来
learn
表
from
现
sculpture
质感，
how to
表
use
现色彩。
materials and surface
和
textures
这个立
to
体
express
的空间
colors.
组合。
Space
雕塑和油画都
combination,
可以
both
去
sculpture
需
and
要
oil
考
painting
虑
lead
空
to
间组
consider
合和
the
布局。
combination
油
and
画
the
家
layout
可
of the
能
space.
可以
Oil painters can
雕
learn
塑
how
中
to construct the scenes of the space from sculpture,
如何
while
构建
sculptor can learn
空
how
间
to
感
use line and shapes to express the
或者借
scenes of the
鉴
space
雕
and
塑的
layers from oil paintings.
立体投影这种用色彩来表现就更加有立体感，而雕塑家呢可以从油画中学习到如何运用线条和形态来表达空间感和层次感。
That's very interesting. I remember you were talking about time as being a factor, in the experience of this art, right, of sculpting. And, I know that with your own art, I believe time is an aspect as well with your creative process, right? Because I know one of the things that your work speaks to is the force of gravity, right?
Correct.
So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that creative process?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, one of the other aspects of sculpture is that I always am aware of is the fact that because it's something that exists in three-dimensional space and it's something that exists that requires like time to experience it. I always like to think of sculpture as something that always, whether it's acknowledged or not, has to incorporate the sense of gravity, like the reality of this is something that's in real space. So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm making these kind of balloon sculptures, or they're not really balloon sculptures, but I'm using balloons as the mold for casting in plaster. And as I'm making them, like the weight of the plaster creates the shape of the form. So gravity is always part of it, you know, and so gravity, and a lot of the times I come from a little bit of this background of arte povera, which is, you know, the Italian artists in the 1960s who were working with any material that was around, like coaxing out the poetics of like a branch, or coaxing out, you know, this sort of form of like a trash bag or something like that, and using those things as kind of the basis for looking at different ideas of form, different ideas of sculpture, different ideas of how we interact with common objects and common materials. And so when I'm thinking about these things, I have that stuff in my head of letting, in many ways, like the artwork can create itself. Like I end up sort of being slightly a conduit, or I end up, like it ends up being a conversation between me and the thing that I'm making. And as you're making something, it starts telling you, like, I'm going to do this, I'll let you do this, I'm not going to let you do that. And then you have to act and interact with the piece, and then that's how the piece sort of completes itself. It sort of tells you that.
So your creative process for your sculptures is almost like a journey of discovery for you.
Yeah. I mean, very much like when I'm in the sort of process of making something, sculpture, you know, by its kind of, just by its nature, can sort of take a couple of different routes. One route is you have something that you are going to make, and in order to make it, you have to plan it out, you know, step by step, the sort of engineering aspect of it. I have to make molds, I do things in silicone, and I work in resins, and there's a lot of forethought that has to go through with that. But then there's the other side of, like, when you're in the middle of it and you're making something, you're interacting with this thing that is then beginning to tell you what it wants in order for it to complete itself, and you sort of have that kind of outer body experience with this object that has its own spirit, has its own soul, and it tells you, like, this is what it needs to be finished. So there are those two kind of interesting contrasts of the sort of engineering and the plan out forethought part of it, and then there's the actual creative part of it, which the work tells you sort of where it wants to go.
Yeah, you know, that's really cool to, you know, understand how you're having this, you know, there's almost this artistic conversation going on between you, the artist, and this force of nature, right? And then that's your art is what's created by that conversation.
And it's the force of nature, and it's also, it's like the force of history as well, like, because you're working in this sort of, like, in this moment, but you're also acknowledging, you know, the artwork that is always in my head, that's always that I'm thinking about. And so there's that sort of the moment, and that's it, but it's also acknowledging, you know, the work of, like, Giuseppe Pannoni or Robert Therian or somebody like that always is influencing my work. And it's not just sculptors, it's, you know, it's anybody who's ever made art. Like, a lot of that stuff comes through in subtle ways and not so subtle ways, but it's always there. And you're always acknowledging it.
That's really cool. That, like, I know something that I was always transfixed by was, wave photography, and that's a phenomenon that's really gravity is a huge part of, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about that when I was hearing about, reading about your work, and how gravity plays a huge part in that. So that's really great to hear about. Thank you.
Yeah.
When it comes to your creative process, right? Are there any methods that you might employ when you're collaborating with another type of artist, such as a painter, that just to really, be able to complement each other's work?
Yeah, in terms of collaboration, I mean, I haven't done like too much in the way of like direct collaboration in which we're working on like a similar piece, but I think of collaboration more in terms of like curation, like when I'm showing with another painter, when I'm showing with another artist, and we start figuring out, it's really more curatorial decisions of like, what are our common themes, what are, like, whether it's something large, like we both grew up in rural areas in the eastern United States, or we both like the color blue or something like that, like where we have sort of commonality or common ground aspects to the work, and also like if we have like a similar kind of temperament to how we approach making things. Like I just recently had a show with another artist, Mary Little, who is her work is two-dimensional, but it's really more sculptural. It's all done just in canvas, and she stitches it, and she creates all of these forms through like working on the sewing machine. But like we have a similar temperament that complements each other, even though we're not doing the exact same thing, even though we're both doing like sculpture. But hers is much more kind of traditionally two-dimensional, and mine's more in the round. But we, like, the methodology feels very in line with each other.
Yeah. Very complimentary. Wow. So are there any like specific instances that you've had a successful? I mean, I know we just talked about that one in particular. Are there any other types of artists, like maybe architects or other painters that you might have had like successful collaborations with in your own life?
Well, mostly in terms of like curatorial, work. It's interesting, like, because curating shows is a very kind of interesting aspect, because it's a creative endeavor in the same way that like making sculpture is a creative endeavor, but it's really more about creating stories and creating themes and creating ideas. So when I think about working with other artists, like I've worked with Todd Williamson for years and years, and Todd and I put shows together where we're working on just, it's interesting that I mentioned the color blue. We put a show together which was based on not just like that particular color, but just that idea of using a certain color as like a jumping off point for how our work works together. And then you start getting into ideas of like, what does blue mean? Is it the sky? Is it the ocean? Is it so then you start representing color, or not color, you start representing water, and then what does like water have to do with both of our work? And like my work is like quite literally solid, but does it have like a water element to it, And so those kind of things start coming up in his work, and his work is like frozen because it's an image that he's created, but like the idea of water sort of permeates the sort of feel of the piece. So that's where, those kind of collaborations really come together and start like shining, and like that's when like the work really starts humming together, where you really have honed in on what a certain topic is that you're exploring, and then how those work sort of reinforce that topic.
That's awesome. Yeah, you really start to, you're telling a story with your art, right?
Exactly. You're always telling stories.
Yeah. And that's just incredible. And that you brought up the color blue. It's my favorite color. I mean, that really, that's awesome. I can tell. No, yeah, and it's just incredible, right? The water. Our bodies are over 75% water, or something like that. I mean, that's very, very beautiful to hear about. So then, as far as like the materials and the creative techniques go, how do you see painting and sculpting being able to, or comparing and contrasting for you personally?
Well, yeah, well, it's interesting. Like, I have a really, I've traditionally had a very difficult relationship with color.
Yeah.
And part of it is because I get excited about a material, and whether the material, and I shift a lot in a lot of my work. So, I mean, by shift a lot, I mean I switch materials a lot. I feel like there are threads that constantly are running through all of my work, but sometimes I'm working just in Scotch tape. Sometimes I'm working in cast plaster. Sometimes I'm working in porcelain. So I shift materials a lot, right? Though a lot of the themes still come up in all of the respective examples. But what I've always had this interesting contrast with is I like the material to just show itself. So in some way, when I'm doing something, if I'm adding color to it, or if I'm putting a surface color on it, I feel like in some way that's like cheating the material. So it's sort of like that idea of, we have this idea of like Greek antiquity of being kind of white statues that are like purity of form and things like that. But when you hear about the history of it, they're actually like, they've all been like garishly painted, like all of these antiques that get dug up across the Mediterranean originally were all painted. So we think about this idea of like ancient sculpture totally different than the people that actually made them.
Yeah.
And so when it comes down to me, and so when I'm making things and I'm dealing with color, I think about it in terms of like painting, and because it's not what I do and I'm unfamiliar with painting, I have this kind of like hard relationship. And so what I do is I sort of like pare it down. So instead of like working multiple forms of color, I'll just sort of keep something like very monochromatic, and I'll add color to it, but subtly, so that it's still like the form is still the primary kind of mover of the piece, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. Well, maybe I'm incorrect on this, but it seems to me that it's a very popular thing among sculptors to do more monochromatic works. Well, why do you think this is?
Well, I think it might be a lot of that. It's because, like when you're using different materials, like there's a history to that material, So it's a question of like how much you want to manipulate that material. Like if you're thinking about using like wood has inherent qualities to it, like with grain and color that's already there. How much do you want to change that, and how much do you want to alter that? That's the thing that comes up. Like when I'm doing like the balloon sculptures that I've been working on lately, I'm adding colors to it, but I'm tinting it. So the color is actually, it's not on the surface, it's embedded inside the actual plaster. It's almost more like a fresco painting, because the color is actually like part of the piece as opposed to being on top of it. And so I think, just kind of to answer your question, like sculpture, if you're doing, say, like found object work or assemblage work, or even if you're doing like welded steel sculpture, like all of that thing, all of those pieces have their own kind of aesthetic history to them. And for a lot of sculptors, they let that sort of take the forefront, as opposed to then sort of adding a certain color, or adding, instead of adding, like it's sometimes, you add by subtraction by not putting anything on it.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like there's a deep sense of appreciation for the material that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to showcase that beauty that's already inherently present.
Exactly.
Jiannan, as far as what I just wanted to ask you about the inspiration and enlightenment that you personally draw from the interaction between these two respective fields of painting and sculpting. How do you incorporate these characteristics into your own work as a painter?
不同的艺术家有不同的体会和感受。我觉得呢，首先可以研究雕塑和油画的著名艺术家，分析他们的创作风格、色彩运用、表现的手法等，从中获取灵感。另外可以考虑多媒介搭配。也就是我们常说的混搭，例如在油画作品中加入雕塑元素，或在雕塑作品中加入油画元素。第三呢，在表现手法上，我们可以在油画作品中用线条和立体的绘画风格来表现出雕塑空间感和纹理感，或者在雕塑中运用油画的色彩风格和明暗画，最后雕塑和油画的材料和技术不断在演变，你可以从中获取新的灵感和知识。并将这些新材料和技术融入到自己的创作时，我相信会有很大的经济喜悦和收获。
Or charosaccio or the oil paintings in sculpture. Finally, the materials and technical of the sculpture and oil painting are constantly evolving, and you can get new inspiration from them. And incorporate these new materials and technical into your own creation. I believe there will be great surprise and gains.
Beautiful. Thank you. Shishi, Jiannan. So, Joe, Jiannan, you're both winners. You're in the top 10 of the very first LABA International Art Festival Awards. I just would love to hear about how you might consider working together as artists in the future and collaborating.
I think it would be a really interesting and wonderful possibility to explore. I mean, I think of his imagery is very compelling, and his use of color and like these kind of like these shifting palettes that I see in his paintings. It would be interesting to see if I would incorporate something like that in some of the work that I'm doing, and just to like have like I was saying earlier, that sort of like direct or indirect influence, but more of a direct influence of using kind of maybe some of his color palette as part of some of my sculptures, and seeing how that starts affecting the way I look at making the work, and how I look at like how it affects like the form, and how it affects seeing the kind of sculpture kind of come together, and whether it creates tension or whether it really creates like a contrast that like makes it light up more, so I mean, that would be something that I think would be really interesting to explore, and then and talk to Jen a little bit more about his ideas on art, and talk about his kind of much more about like the content of each individual piece, and we have that conversation and see where that takes us in terms of putting some of the work together and seeing if there's a collaboration there. It'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Jiannan, what about you? What are your thoughts?
油画和雕塑虽然的表现形式不同，但是艺术的观点呢、思维都有很多都应该是相通的。不如我们可以参与同一个展览活动啊，或者共同来 在一起创作啊，或者是扩展每个人的艺术视野和创作灵感，从而呢相互借鉴和启发。因为雕塑跟油画都是表现这种物体啊这种立体的观感嘛，它颜色就是用光影来去体现这个立体感，那个雕塑就直接做成立体感，所以大家都可以互相借鉴、互相学习的，在提高艺术创作水平，这个互相来共同学习，就会有很大的互补和提高。
This is how I look at this question. Although oil painting and sculpture have different forms of expression, there may be many similarities in artistic viewpoints. For example, we can participate in the same expression to expand everyone's artistic version and creative inspiration, so as to learn from and inspire each other and improve the level artistic creation.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Mr. Jiannan Huang. Joe, man, it's been so great having you here on the show and chatting with you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed learning more about these two renowned and celebrated artists. Thank you. We'll see you next time.